If you were standing on a British high street in 1994, you could feel it. A sudden, electric shift in the atmosphere. After years of grey post-Thatcherite austerity and the brooding, flannel-clad gloom of American grunge, Britain finally decided to turn the volume up and the lights on. Welcome back! Today, we're revisiting a decade that didn't just give us a soundtrack, it gave us a new way to be British. Britpop wasn't just about four-piece bands and catchy choruses. It was a cultural earthquake that redefined our fashion, our politics, and our national pride. From the muddy fields of Nebworth to the champagne-soaked halls of Downing Street, this is the story of how a generation of musicians made us feel like the center of the universe again. Whether you were Team Blur or Team Oasis, this journey is for you. Let's head back to the 90s. As the early 1990s began, Britain felt uncertain again. The country was emerging from recession. High streets carried empty shops, and the mood was subdued. On the radio, much of what we heard came from across the Atlantic. Grunge dominated raw, distorted, and inward-looking. Bands such as Nirvana and Pearl Jam captured a generation's anxiety, and their music was powerful. Yet for many British listeners, something felt slightly out of step. The tone was heavy, the outlook bleak, and it did not quite echo our own traditions of sharp observation and wry humor. There was a quiet longing for music that sounded unmistakably British songs that reflected our streets, our accents, and our ordinary lives. The spirit of earlier movements lingered in memory, the defiance of the mods, the swagger of the rockers, youth cultures that had once given the nation its own voice. When news spread in 1994 of Kurt Cobain's passing, it felt like the closing of a chapter. Almost overnight, attention turned homeward. Young people traded flannel for Parkers and Fred Perry shirts, stepping back into the daylight. They wanted melody, confidence, and something they could sing together. It was the moment optimism began to sound like Britain again. At its heart, Britpop was a quiet but powerful rebellion of identity. It was not only about music, it was about rediscovering who we were. After years of looking outward, British youth began to look inward again. Bands such as Suede and Blur wrote songs filled with familiar images: grey suburbs, crowded buses, London pigeons, and the strange beauty of an ordinary bank holiday. This was not the glossy pop of the 1980s. It was sharper, more observant, melodic, yet grounded in everyday life. It spoke to both the suburban middle class and the restless working class, giving them a shared voice. The identity that emerged felt playful but self-assured. Britain began celebrating its quirks again: the accent, the humor, the irony. There was a sense of cultural confidence returning, echoing earlier youth movements. The spirit of the mods, with their style and modernity, and the rebellious energy of the rockers seemed to resurface in a new form. This was a cultural turning of the wheel. Suddenly, being British was not about nostalgia for empire or rigid tradition. It was about finding meaning in the ordinary. The philosophy was simple. Modern life might be chaotic, even absurd, but it was ours, and this rebellion did not need violence. It was carried through 3-minute songs, sharp lyrics, and a quiet, unmistakable swagger that felt, for the first time in years, completely earned. It remains the greatest soap opera in music history, the Battle of Britpop. In August 1995, when Blur and Oasis released singles on the same day, it wasn't just a chart race, it was a proxy war for the soul of the country. It was the art school boys from the south versus the hard-nosed brothers from the north. You were either a fan of Damon Albarn's playful, satirical pop or Noel Gallagher's anthemic, salt-of-the-earth rock. The media, led by the NME and the Evening News, turned it into a national obsession. Even our parents had an opinion on it over Sunday dinner. Blur won the battle of the singles with Country House, but Oasis arguably won the war of longevity. More importantly, this rivalry proved that guitar music could still be the most important thing in the world. It bridged the North-South divide by giving the entire country something to argue about that wasn't politics.
Oasis is a bit too heavy for me, it's a bit too samey. The Blur one's more bouncy, catchy.
It was a moment of peak tribalism, but a joyful one, a time when the Top of the Pops countdown felt like the most vital 10 minutes of the week. By the mid-90s, the energy of the music scene had become so undeniable that even the suits in Westminster wanted a piece of it. Enter New Labour and Tony Blair. The term Cool Britannia began to circulate, suggesting that Britain was no longer a fading power but a creative superpower. This culminated in the famous 1997 Downing Street party, where Noel Gallagher was pictured with a glass of champagne alongside the new Prime Minister. For a moment, it felt like the barriers between the establishment and the underground had vanished. There was a genuine sense of optimism. The grey years of the Tories were over, and a young, vibrant government seemed to be in step with the music we loved. Of course, hindsight tells us it was a carefully managed PR exercise, but at the time, the Cool Britannia vibe was intoxicating. It gave the UK a renewed sense of cultural authority on the world stage. We weren't just a museum of history, we were a factory of the future, leading the way in art, film, and fashion. For decades, the Union Jack had been a complicated symbol, often associated with the far right or the rigid traditions of the empire. But in the 1990s, Britpop reclaimed it. It was stripped of its baggage and turned into a pop art icon. The most famous example, of course, was Noel Gallagher's Epiphone Supernova guitar, painted in the flag's bold reds, whites, and blues. Then came Geri Halliwell at the 1997 Brit Awards in that dress. Suddenly, the flag was everywhere on t-shirts, scooters, and record sleeves. This wasn't about nationalism in a dark sense. It was about brand Britain. It was a celebration of our creative export. We were proud of our music, our design, and our influence. For the 40-plus generation today, seeing that flag still triggers a memory of a time when the UK felt vibrant and unified. It was a visual shorthand for a nation that had finally found its confidence again, turning a historic relic into a symbol of the coolest party on earth. The 1990s felt different for British women. You could sense it in magazines, on television, in the way girls spoke a little louder on the bus. This was the era of girl power, carried around the world by the Spice Girls, who took the bright confidence of Cool Britannia and turned it into something unapologetically female. They weren't waiting to be invited in, they kicked the door open in platform trainers. But beyond the glitter and chart hits, another shift was happening. The so-called Ladette emerged voices like Denise Van Outen, Zoe Ball, and Sarah Cox. They laughed loudly, ordered their own pints, and refused to shrink themselves to fit old expectations. To some, it seemed brash. To many young women watching, it felt like oxygen. This was not rebellion for shock value. It was presence. Women stepping into indie music studios and sports broadcasts, claiming space that had long been closed. The new woman of the 1990s did not simply ask for equality, she assumed it. And in doing so, she quietly reshaped Britain's social rhythm into something freer, fairer, and far more alive. Britpop fashion was a glorious mashup of mod culture and casual sportswear. It was a working-class hero aesthetic that was both accessible and sharp. The uniform was clear. Adidas track tops, Fred Perry polos, Clark's wallabies, and the ubiquitous Parker. It was a style that said you were ready for a gig or a football match at a moment's notice. This wasn't about high-fashion catwalks, it was about the high street. It was a look that belonged to the people. The attitude was just as important as the clothes, a mix of dry wit, a bit of front, and a refusal to be intimidated. We saw it in the way Liam Gallagher stood at the mic, and the way Jarvis Cocker moved on stage. It was a celebration of the ordinary Joe made extraordinary. This fashion legacy still lingers today. You can't walk through a British city without seeing the echoes of that 1995 silhouette. It was a decade where we wore our identity on our sleeves, quite literally. We cannot talk about the 90s without talking about the tabloids. The rise of Britpop coincided with a massive explosion in celebrity culture. Magazines like Select, The Face, and Loaded became the Bibles of the era. The battle of Britpop was largely fueled by the ink of the NME and Melody Maker. For the first time, indie musicians were being chased by paparazzi like they were Hollywood royalty. It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made the music scene feel like the most exciting place on earth. On the other, it began the era of fame for fame's sake. We watched the rise and fall of Cool Britannia through the lens of the Sun and the Mirror. Every weekend at Glastonbury, or every night at the Good Mixer pub in Camden, was documented as if it were a national crisis. For us watching from home, it felt like we were part of an exclusive club. It was a pre-social media age where the ink still mattered, and the media was the engine that kept the Britpop party running at full speed. In the summer of 1996, music and sport collided to create a moment of national synchronicity that we haven't seen since. Euro 96 was hosted in England, and the unofficial anthem was Three Lions by Baddiel, Skinner, and the Lightning Seeds. The phrase, "Football's coming home," became the heartbeat of the country. After years of football being associated with hooliganism and tragedy, this tournament felt like a rebirth. The sun shone, the beer flowed, and for a few weeks, the entire nation was united in a way that felt genuine. Even if you didn't like football, you were singing the songs. It was the Britpop summer. The optimism of the music had infected the terraces. When Gareth Southgate missed that penalty, it felt like a collective heartbreak, but the sense of pride remained. Euro 96 was the peak of the decade's feel-good factor, a time when it really did feel like Britain was the best place in the world to be. Every era has its definitive climax, and for Britpop, it was August 10th and 11th, 1996. Oasis played to 250,000 people over 2 nights at Knebworth House. Over 2.5 million people, about 4% of the UK population, had applied for tickets. It remains the largest demand for a concert in British history. Standing in that crowd, it felt like the entire generation had gathered in one field. It was the ultimate validation of the working-class dream. As Liam Gallagher looked out over that sea of bucket hats and waving flags, it was clear that Britpop had conquered everything. But, as with all peaks, the only way was down. Knebworth was the last great party, before the hangover of the late 90s set in. It was the moment the bubble was at its biggest and brightest. For those who were there, and those who watched the highlights on the news, it remains the untouchable symbol of a time when a British band was the biggest thing on the planet. So, why did Britpop change us? Because it taught a generation that they didn't have to look elsewhere for inspiration. It reminded us that our stories, our accents, and our modern life were worth singing about. It took the grey out of the British sky and replaced it with a sense of swagger and possibility. While the Cool Britannia party eventually ended, the identity it forged remains. We are more confident, more creative, and more comfortable in our own skin because of those years. The 90s wasn't just a decade, it was a state of mind. What was your Britpop moment? Were you at Knebworth? Or was your life changed by a single CD you bought at HMV? Let me know in the comments below. Let's share the memories. Don't forget to like and subscribe as we keep exploring the history that made us. Cheers for watching.